welcome back. And we're moving into our first conversation for this morning, getting an update on the local and regional front as to what the implications are of the United States pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. And we have with us from the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, also called the 5Cs, Carlos Fuller, International and Regional Officer. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning.
So for context, let's begin by discussing the Paris Agreement as we know it and what the objective of this accord was, or still is.
Certainly. The Paris Agreement is a new agreement under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which brings all the countries together to address three issues. First, to limit global warming to as far below 2 degrees Celsius as possible, aiming for 1.5, which is what CARICOM would really like it to be. Secondly, to change our development pathway away from fossil fuels into a renewable energy and more sustainable lifestyle. And thirdly, to provide the resources for developing countries like Belize to achieve that target. So those were the three main objectives of the Paris Agreement.
Yeah. Now, if we were to step back into December 2015, when the entire world was celebrating that there had been this very important agreement made by the majority of countries across the world, I believe that with the recent pulling out by President Donald Trump and his administration, a lot of people are left wondering what happens now. All the happiness and sense of accomplishment that came with having the agreement, does this mean that the fulfillment of the objectives are in jeopardy?
Well, first of all, we're certainly very disappointed with the announcement by the Trump administration that they would be withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. However, I think there is not sufficient momentum that it is indeed going to make it more difficult to achieve those targets, but I think the momentum is now on its way. Yeah. And so in that regard, I don't see the Paris Agreement falling apart. Yeah. Certainly, we've heard from the major nations, from China, the European Union, India, Canada, everyone, we're moving forward, and developing countries, of course, are also recognized it's our only salvation right now. That is the best thing we have on record right now. Yeah. So I don't see it falling apart.
Let me put this in some perspective here, and I don't really want to get too much into American politics per se. However, you seem to have a situation where President Trump is seemingly bent on reversing a majority of the stands and the issues that former President Barack Obama had lobbied for and was on the forefront of these issues, including the issue of climate change, which brought about the Paris Agreement. In terms of developing nations, Belize included, particularly on this side of the world, the Caribbean, it would seem as if though we are to an extent reliant on the United States for assistance on this end. Correct me if I'm wrong. Mm-hmm. With the withdrawal of the United States under the Trump administration, what implications, if any, are there for countries such as Belize and some of the other island nations?
Well, certainly we are, as I said, disappointed. And in fact, the US really led the world from 2009. In fact, I believe Obama was too aggressive back in 2009 in making announcements with China, which caused the Copenhagen Accord to fall apart. However, I think he was much more inclusive in the ensuing 6 years. And so we brought together a coalition that indeed ensured the Paris Agreement did occur in 2015. No, you're quite right. They are the big brother to the north. Mm-hmm. However, surprisingly, where climate change assistance is concerned into the Caribbean, most of our support has come from the European Union, not from the US. In fact, it was just last year we got a major project under the USAID for the eastern and southern part of the Caribbean, which we're implementing. And so that is the really first major effort that the US has put into the area of climate change, into the Caribbean. And we hope it continues, of course, under the Trump administration. But in other areas, indeed, so for example, we know that the U.S. Energy Department has been working very seriously with the Caribbean in coming up with renewable energy initiatives. So I could see that maybe being impacted to some extent. We're hoping it's not going to be as much as possible, because indeed we recognize in the Caribbean we have got to start to rely on our own indigenous sources of energy as opposed to continuing importing fossil fuels. We recall 2-3 years ago when petroleum prices went up to something like $110 per barrel. We were expending 60 to 70% of our foreign exchange only to buy petroleum. That is we have to use our solar, our wind, our geothermal, our biomass potential indeed for energy.
Now, I suppose one of the areas that I've been looking at is perhaps the main objective of the Paris Agreement, which is being able to cap the raising temperatures to 2 degrees or 1.5, which is the ideal. Now, excluding the resources factor, if we were to focus on only that, we know that the United States is one of the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases. With their withdrawal, what will that do? Or, I mean, it's very early on, but what are the possible outcomes when it comes to being able to hit the overall target? 1.5, ideally, but if not, no more than 2.
No, indeed. In fact, as I said, it does make it more difficult. However, we've had some very good news coming out of the states. California, the northeastern states, Florida, Hawaii. Just over the weekend, the Senate just passed a major resolution establishing their own committee to meet the Paris Agreement targets. So I could see at the local level, and in fact, that is where implementation is going to occur, not at the international level, it is at the local level. And if you look at the Paris Agreement, it does not mention the United States of America, it does not mention China, it does not mention any country at all. Each country made an intended nationally determined contribution. This is what I'm going to bring to the party.
Yeah.
And how you do it at home is your business.
Yeah.
You must then report on how you have done it. So that is going to be the issue.
Yeah.
They are going to, the states are going to come up with their measures.
Yeah.
How it's being reported, it would come through the Trump administration.
Yeah.
So that is where we see, we don't know how it's going to play out.
I was going to ask that question because obviously when it comes to the reporting mechanisms, the plans that need to be put in place, those would have to come through the overall government. Is there going to be perhaps some kind of convening to make decisions as to where the individual states would be able to fit in, since they have committed individually to still attempt to meet the targets?
Well, in fact, at our Conference of the Parties, which occur every year in November, December, we have what we call local governments convening, and they then talk about what they're doing, because we recognize, again, no government is the major emitter. Yeah. So, for example, while Prime Minister Barrow in his INDC said Belize is going to do so and so, it's not the government's emissions. It is going to be yours and mine. It is going to be the industries, the cars. They're the ones. So it's how you collect the data and provide it. So there is going to be that mechanism. And in fact, I think one of the things we have to look at also is that in the United States of America, it is the State Department which represents the US at these climate change meetings. Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, is in favor of the climate change accord, of the Paris Agreement. So again, how is he going to tie in his personal feelings and what the administration has told him? And so again, it is going to be how he interprets what occurs at the state level to be able to report on what the US is doing.
Yeah.
So while you represent the 5 Cs in general, what do you see us as Belizeans being able to do to meet our end of this agreement locally?
Indeed, Belize has made a very strong commitment towards meeting the Paris Agreement based on our existing policies and measures on energy. And in fact, as you know, Belize has a huge renewable energy resource already, which it is using to meet, I think 90% of our domestic production comes from renewable energy, while we import about 50% of our power from Mexico. But we are certainly, every development we do is not is based on renewable energy, nothing on petroleum products. So we are moving in that area. I know we're also moving in the area of how do we address our issues from transport, because that is our now major emitter on the energy sector is in transport. But our biggest emitter of all is in forestry. The illegal cutting again. So again, and we know it's a major national and international issue that we have to address. Yeah. So I think that is where we will be doing it, and I think we're already taking on the measures on board. We have a program called Red Plus, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, which is funded under the UN. Again, I think it's an initiative that's going to take hold in the next couple of years where we'll be addressing that issue.
Yeah. Now, one of the things we have seen as a result of the decision by the United States is a very intense period of education and awareness. But it is coupled with those who support President Trump's decision in going back to what we haven't said in a long time, which is climate change is not real and only to serve the purposes of particular countries and particular interests. What is your take on the conversation that has ensued following the decision by the United States?
Well, indeed, I think listening to the talk shows over the weekend where we heard Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, and the head of the EPA, they all now acknowledge climate change is a reality. Yeah. It is being produced by mankind, carbon dioxide, methane, and so on. So the science is now there. Yeah. Even the skeptics are believing in the science. It's an economic issue. That is where they're coming from. Yeah. And as they have said, technology has allowed the use of fossil fuels to be less impactful on the environment by being able to start to harness the CO2 and doing these things. And I think that is going to play a significant role in it. Yeah. But certainly the international movement is to move away from the use of fossil fuels. And so even though the price of fossil fuels is now down to like $40 per barrel, there's a glut on the market. People are not buying it. Mm-hmm. Why? Because we have this move away to renewable energy, and you're not seeing as much drilling. In fact, I understand 90% of the oil wells, exploratory oil wells, are now idle. People are not exploring anymore because
they don't see a future.
Exactly. There's no value in it. So, as many people have said, the coal industry, the U.S. is looking in the past instead of into the future. Yeah. Coal is dead. We're not going to bring back steel engines, people shoveling coal and putting it into trains anymore. That is done. Yeah. In fact, even petroleum is out. We're now into natural gas as opposed to petroleum. So even Exxon, Shell, and so on, they're no longer said petroleum companies. They're energy companies because they recognize also they're into energy, not necessarily petroleum.
Yeah. What also on the same note, we've seen, when President Trump makes his announcement, he says that he feels that the United States can get a better deal, and that's tapping into the economic side of it. We also saw the immediate reaction from other countries saying there is no renegotiation that will take place. This is the best deal that we have been able to work out. What does that say in terms of the future for the Paris Agreement? What if there is a situation where the United States comes back and says, well, I no longer want to commit to the 100 billion as was first agreed?
Well, in fact, that's an interesting part, and I think that's where we're hearing doublespeak. Yeah. Because, as I said, the Paris Agreement does not mention the U.S. at all. Yeah. In fact, there are no countries mentioned in the Paris Agreement. There are all these contributions that parties will give, and it was based on going up into Paris so that people know what was coming in, and hence could come to an agreement. Yeah. When countries ratified, you could then have changed your INDC to your NDC, or you could have used your original one. Most countries use the original one. Yeah. However, next year we have what is called the facilitative dialogue. That is the countries to get together to discuss, based on these NDCs, how are we achieving this target? Will we achieve it? And that is where countries will then modify their NDCs to be starting in 2020. So the US does have a chance to say, look, my NDC was so high and yours was so low, come up. to achieve that target, because in fact we need all the countries to ramp up, because even with our NDCs as it is, the target is much closer to 2.7 and 3 degrees as opposed to the 2 degrees that we have written down.
Yeah.
So we have to ramp it up if we're going to achieve that target. This is where the US can say, look, I am already reached what you guys need to come up, as opposed to we need to come down.
Yeah.
And I think that is where we will have a very strong argument with them against it, saying, if you're saying it's the issue is China and India, let them come up and match you.
Now, in addition to being able to encourage people to go green and move away from fossil fuels, the money does matter, and the money does matter especially for countries like Belize and for our region at this point, and other countries that are feeling the implications of climate change already. In fact, a part of the commitment from that money was to be able to fund projects to mitigate the effects that we're already seeing, and also to be able to help us move towards a greener energy resource. So, without the United States, there's still all the other countries that are involved. Right. So this money will still be flowing into this country and this region?
Yes, it will. Again, even before the Paris Agreement, we spoke about this $100 billion per year by 2020, which is going to come from private and public resources. So it is not only that a country is going to give its money from its treasury, it's going to encourage investments. So for example, a GE will say, well, yes, I will invest a 1 gigawatt plant in Jamaica in wind turbines. That's an investment. It's not a gift. So by the US saying we're not going to allow it anymore, suddenly their industries will not be able to do the investments they had wanted to do in the first place. And secondly, the $100 billion is not only from the US, it's from all the world. The US was going to be a contributor towards it. In fact, Obama had pledged $3 billion in the first tranche to the GCF. $1 billion came in, and so we don't know if the other $2 billion are going to come in. But indeed, I said, we don't see a major fall off there. Secondly, I don't know if you saw in the news that Bloomberg has pledged that the US said that they were going to cut their contributions to the Secretariat. And Bloomberg said, I will put in the $15 million and you won't miss it. So again, we're seeing private benefactors coming in, picking up those pledges.
Yeah.
Now let's localize the conversation once again, because I'm looking at two different factors, if I may, that came from what you mentioned earlier. The emissions from automotive transport, and of course the continued deforestation in certain areas of the country. When I look at the fact that in Belize City, for instance, there is a booming auto industry in terms of the sale of vehicles. Everybody owns a vehicle, everybody wants to be the it guy with a new vehicle or a new second-hand vehicle, whatever it may be. When you look at how that is set up, some of us are purchasing vehicles that may not necessarily be as fuel efficient or as energy efficient based on the year and the model of the vehicle and what have you. So you have more vehicles out there that have higher emissions versus some of the 2017 vehicles, for instance, where the manufacturers are mindful of all of these things and are putting out better product, in a manner of speaking. And then you look at the fact that the forestry department is limited in its resources to be able to fully provide oversight of areas that may be contentious for illegal logging and what have you. How do we monitor and how do we tangibly affect the way how these two elements come to play?
Well, and Isani, you're quite right. And in fact, that is where the Paris Agreement says we have to change our development paradigm. As you recall, in the past, our governments across the region, not only Belize, have always said, well, if you buy a new car, you can afford it, so you pay 120% duty. If you buy a cheap car, you pay 5% duty or only stamp tax. Which if you want to encourage energy efficient vehicle, you should switch it around. You should say, look, a 4-cylinder vehicle which is new or is biodiesel or some other thing, you know, that pays zero tax, and the more the older, more polluting ones should pay more. In fact, if you look at El Salvador now, you cannot import a vehicle that is older than 1998. It is illegal to bring it into the country. You know, so that's the kind of things that we need to put into place. Secondly, even our land development has always been the government. You apply for a lease and you get a lease, and government will watch. After a year, you have not cut down anything, then you get charged. As opposed to saying, "Wow, you're maintaining the forest. You don't have to pay tax." The entire development paradigm has got to change, and that's what the Paris Agreement tells us. You need to go back and reflect on what you're doing. Look at the whole economy as a whole to see, are we being penny wise and pound foolish?
Yeah, you know, and I think that's the importance of having this conversation now. Instead of seeing the move by the United States as doom and gloom, it is important to show that the rest of the world continues to work towards this goal, and there are efforts that need to be made even within the country. So let's take it back to the role of the 5 Cs, obviously, working within the regional context and that having implication in Belize. What are some of the current priority actions taking place, especially engagement in some of these very same issues you just pointed out?
Well, certainly this is one of the issues that we have to go back out into the Caribbean, that don't lose heart.
Yeah.
There is a process underway, and let us look at what the Paris Agreement does say. So, for example, even though the US made the announcement on Thursday, it takes them 3 years after the agreement came into force for them to be able to submit a letter. So they cannot say they're leaving out officially until November 2019. That is when that letter is achieved, reaches the UN Secretary General desk. It then takes a year after that for it to come into force. So the US is going to be bound into it until November 2020. And you know what?
Meeting all obligations.
That's right. And you know what the year, November 2020 is? Elections in the US. So I can see climate change being the biggest thing on the agenda. And that would then determine what happens with the Paris Agreement and the US. I could see again a big 180-degree change.
But that does not stop them from reneging on what they have committed to between that time.
Certainly. However, their NDC is for the year 2025. So it just means that indeed, if they do nothing, they have to do a lot in a much smaller time. So again, we have to see how that plays out. But then at the regional level, certainly the 5 Cs, we need to continue our work in adaptation. We recognize that climate change is occurring, it's affecting us. We see what is occurring down in Monkey River, across all of our keys, across all the islands, of all the massive erosion, the coral reef bleaching, droughts, severe floods. All of those things continue to occur, and we need to continue to do the intervention measures, accessing the resources, but also using our own resources to address those needs.
Now, one of the things that we have seen, and you know, going to the idea of encouraging renewable energy, one of the things that we have seen in other Caribbean countries is a very strong push towards households, individuals adapting renewable energy, and we haven't seen that take foot as much in Belize. There are some companies now that supply, but it is still very prohibitive in terms of cost. Is there perhaps a regional approach to be able to not only push for the development of industries in renewable energy, but also get the buy-in from individuals within their household?
No, interestingly, in fact, that is one of the things that we'll be working on this year. That is a carbon market feasible in the Caribbean? We know that in the Kyoto Protocol, we had a carbon market that involved the EU and the major developing countries, India, Brazil, China, and so on. But the Caribbean, having a very small market, was sort of left out. Only one country, Jamaica, had such a project. Since then, we've had these regional markets developing: the California market, Regina in northeastern United States, the Vancouver market, Mexico now has a market, Chile has a market, and we're saying maybe the Caribbean as a group within CARICOM can come up with some mechanism where if we bundle our initiatives together, we can create a price on carbon, have a market that we can then sell and start to trade with California, Canada, and so on. So in fact, we're hoping to have that workshop in the next couple of months where we can bring government, but also more importantly the private sector, because it's not going to be governments again who do it. It's going to be your Belize factories, your Coke, Liat, Caribbean Airlines. Those are going to be the big guys who would do the projects, and where you can get enough carbon and enough money together to be able to start to trade regionally and at the international level.
And looking at upcoming reports that we have to make as well, as you pointed out, from the region and also locally, we are committed to be able to respond as to what our plans are and what efforts we're taking on the ground as well. What is our cycle for reporting?
Well, in fact, I understand Belize is going to do its fourth national communication, begin that process this year. Normally it takes 2 to 3 years to actually develop those reports.
Yeah.
So that cycle, we are in it, and various countries in the Caribbean at various levels. I'm proud to say Belize is one at the forefront on our fourth communication, while others are doing their second. So in fact, we are ahead of the average where that is concerned. But indeed, we are getting the resources from the Global Environmental Facility to undertake these reports. And so, yes, we are meeting our obligations. And it's good to see that indeed our emissions have pretty much stabilized across the region. And our efforts are really now into adaptation. How are we adapting to the impacts of climate change?
And so would you say that it is beneficial that the conversation on a global scale has resumed once again to talk about climate change, even though it is as a result of the United States decision?
No, certainly. It is certainly educational for everyone, because now when you talk about the Paris Agreement and you actually read what's in the Paris Agreement, it's something different than you see coming out in the media. So that's certainly one thing. But in fact, while we had this Paris Agreement, the rule book of the Paris Agreement is still being negotiated. So you had things like a compliance mechanism is hereby established. Well, what is that? So in fact, our ambassador in New York, Janine Felsen, is actually one of the leading people there working on what is going to be this compliance mechanism. And so we have all these issues that we are still negotiating, and we're hoping to finalize next year at the COP in Poland next year. But there's a lot of work still to be undertaken, even in getting the Paris Agreement rolling.
Yeah. Now, some scientists have even said that the 2 degrees is not reachable at this point in time, given the circumstances that we're seeing across the world. Is that the case?
I don't think so. I think, but we have to be aggressive.
Yeah.
We cannot continue business as usual. We have to make the strong measures, and we have to really bring technology and science on board, because at some point, indeed, we have got to reverse the trend of starting to take out carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through some kind of sequestration mechanism. We have the traditional through the forests, but we know technologies are also being able to pull it out,
do it faster.
pull it out exactly and sink it into the ground, coming up with much other mechanisms to address that issue.
In terms of the Trump administration's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, can, to a certain degree, this be attributed to skepticism in terms of believing or really acknowledging the fact that climate change is very much a live issue?
Certainly, we know that the states along the seashores are feeling the effects. New Orleans, Miami, New York, and so on. They are seeing the effects of climate change already. Droughts in the Midwest and in California. So they are feeling the impacts of climate change already. But indeed, you have a special interest group. The coal industry, certain parts of the petroleum industry, who are seeing their way of life going away.
The bottom line is being
exactly
affected.
as opposed to saying we need to transform. So in fact, even the OPEC countries, whose economies are 100% dependent on petroleum, recognize that they have to shift their economies, moving away from the traditional use of petroleum products, of coming up with something that not necessarily has to be burned. So they're seeing a transformation of the economies, and I think that is what many of these people who are looking at that early bottom line don't want to acknowledge. You need to transform it.
Which leads me to this other question now. When you mentioned the OPEC countries and these other oil-rich nations, if I may, you look at Saudi Arabia, that has become this leader in petroleum and the oil industry. how receptive have they been in terms of acknowledging and participating in this gradual shift to renewable energy?
In fact, those countries were one of the biggest skeptics. We had the biggest challenge in the early days of getting them on board, and they were actually obstructionists for the first 10 years of the convention. However, they have come around as we have understood where they were coming from to say, look, you can't just leave us out there and blame us for everything. You are buying it from us anyhow, right? So we have taken their concern aboard, where we have something called the response measures. How are countries responding to climate change? And that is, you have to understand that when you are responding to climate change, you may be alienating a group. How do you involve them as part of the process? And so we have taken their concerns aboard, and they are now transforming their industries. They are now diversifying. They are now creating medical centers, investing in when the age when petroleum goes down to zero. So they are investing in it, and they are putting a significant amount of their resources into making this happen. So we're hoping that continues. We're hoping again that the extreme right wing, where they're concerned, does not also go onto the Trump bandwagon. And so again, that is where we have got to keep on taking out the good message.
And that was going to be actually my final question, because while I think it is very encouraging to see how independent states and independent private companies within the United States are saying that they are fully committed to what is agreed upon in the Paris Agreement, is it not concerning that perhaps those who were pulled into the agreement because they realized they had no other option may see this as a way out as well?
Indeed, that is a possibility. But this is where we have got to continue to tell them, look, you cannot live in the past anymore. People are leaving you behind. U.S. Steel has said, look, if I have to sell steel, whether it's to a nuclear plant, a coal plant, or wind turbines, I'm going to sell steel. And everything seems to be renewable energy. So that is where the science is coming in. That is where the high-tech jobs are in. It is no longer in drilling into the earth and just pulling out coal, creating the issues of lung cancer and everything else that is bad. In fact, we're going into a new age, and if you continue the past, the world's economy will leave you behind.
Okay. Well, any closing thoughts for this conversation?
Just to thank you for coming out. I think it's going to be important that we continue to speak about what is happening on this issue. And yes, we need to continue to spread the word.
All right. Well, thank you for being here and for sharing the perspective of not just Belize, but the region when it comes to the recent happenings with the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlene. Thank you, Zanny.
We're going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we'll be featuring one of the visiting jazz bands here for the Jazz Festival. So stay tuned.